I thought this was a great view this morning. The sun coming up over my right shoulder. I'm down in South Alabama, touring a few nurseries, and I had got some questions during the open garden about when better boxwood were going to be more available. And as you can see behind me, there is an ocean of skylight better boxwood. That's one of the 4 varieties of better boxwood. Behind me, as far back as you can see, they're in both directions further out that you can't see, and they're behind the camera as well. So a lot of better boxwood. There were some spring availability across the country, but it was fairly limited. It takes a little while longer with boxwoods, despite the fact that we consider them pretty easy landscape ornamental plants, and they are. They grow a little slower, which is one of the big, which is one great thing about boxwoods, because they don't get out of control quickly. You know, you can prune on them if you want to, or not prune on them if you want to, depending on what you're trying to get out of them. But you don't have to, once you prune them, they'll kind of keep that shape a little longer than some other things that will just kind of quickly get out of control. These are the new blight-resistant boxwoods that are from breeding over in Europe. Europe had boxwood blight before we did in the US, and so they were a little ahead of us on breeding. And so this is the first introductions from that breeding for blight resistance. And there's, again, 4 kind of different shaped plants, but this is skylight behind me, and it might be the most boxwood where you can kind of, whatever shape you want, you could make it. You could turn it into a cone or some upright narrow thing, or a little low mounding thing. Whatever you want to do with skylight could be done. I've got one of these in the front fence at the house, and I've shown off the 4 that I have in the garden. But again, I think skylight's going to be slightly quicker to get to the shape and the size and everything that you want to do with it. But really, you know, I think boxwoods are, you know, an important landscape ornamental plant. You know, they can just be the thing that just, they can sometimes be the thing, you know, in a knot garden or a formal garden. You know, they can define the entire space, or they can just kind of be the thing that settles the eye in the garden. If you have a lot of, like I do, variegated things and chartreuse things and flowery things and all those kinds of things, you do need a few. And I think if you've seen a lot of any of the touring or videos from the home garden or been there, you will have seen that we do use some green things in there that are just there to settle the eye, basically. And boxwoods are just great for that. And again, they're great. I think we always consider them as, you know, on the sunniest part of a foundation, you know, on the western side of your house or something, but they're great understory plants. Don't discount the fact that they're actually native to woodlands and are great, you know, in understory. So if you've got, you know, almost any space you have in your garden, you know, as long as it's kind of moist, well-drained soil, is going to be kind of perfect for boxwoods. But I think, again, we're going to see a lot more availability in the fall, so I'm just kind of answering that question right now of when we're going to see more of them, and then even the following spring, even more than that, you'll start to see all the varieties become available. And you can go over to the Better Boxwood website and see the basically 4 various shapes that they come in, and pick the one that's going to kind of take the shape that you want it to ultimately be, and then you'll have to do limited pruning on it. Or if you want a boxwood that's just kind of adaptable to be growing tall, small, you know, whatever you want to do, you know, you can find skylight, because I think that's probably the one that's going to be easiest to do, just kind of whatever you want to do. But I thought this morning I'd jump around and see some other interesting things out here in the nursery here in South Alabama. Here's some of those red sky pencil hollies that I showed off last year. We went up from Atlanta and down from Raleigh to Athens, Georgia, and we went over to the research station at UGA and met with Dr. Reuter and talked about this. This is one of his introductions. This is red sky pencil holly. It's an Ilex crenata, so it's a Japanese holly. So it has the small leaves. It's not prickly, upright and narrow, just like you would expect from a sky pencil holly, but it's got all this burgundy new foliage on it. Mine at the house has a little more. These are, if they come through here and prune them, the new growth is where all the burgundy is on them. So that looks like to me they came and pruned them at some point. Now the new growth is coming back out, but you can see it all has this burgundy hue. And this was another plant at the open garden that a couple people asked me about, because it's just, with mine, it was a little ahead of these where they're actively growing, so it had quite a bit more of the burgundy color on it. But great plant, and I really think it adds some interest, to sky pencil hollies, which you typically think about just green and upright and narrow. But this one, every time it's actively growing or flushing, it has this burgundy new growth on it. I'm standing in an ocean of white wedding hydrangeas, and I still think that this, despite the fact that there seems to be 3 new hydrangea paniculatas every single year, it's just kind of amazing how this plant's just kind of taken over the world. We used to have tree hydrangeas that were, it was just kind of another species of hydrangea that, that people liked, but you didn't see a whole lot of them. PG hydrangea was one of the varieties, and Pinky Winky was one of the varieties. And then, of course, Limelight comes along, and people just become absolutely enamored with hydrangea paniculatas. And now, just through a crazy amount of breeding, we just see better and better and more of them coming to market. And again, white wedding, I think this is Buddy Lee, the Encore Azalea inventor. This is one of his, and it just holds the flowers up so big and tall, as you can see in this big giant group. Open field out here, you would expect, the wind to be moving them around. You would expect the overhead irrigation to be weighting the flower heads down. This is another problem that you could potentially have. You have to think about when you were growing something like this, because, literally the bulk of the inflorescences, that weight of that flower when it gets wet can just be pulled right over, and you probably have seen that on some of the older varieties. But this one just holds them up big and tall. The whole field is just flower to flower, basically. It's really, really beautiful out here. Got a couple of these in the garden. There's not a lot of things in the garden back in Raleigh that we have 2 of. I also have Moon Dance. That's another hydrangea paniculata we have as well that I really, really like. But again, I couldn't resist stopping and taking a photo of this absolute sea of white wedding hydrangeas. I have all 5 butterfly candy varieties in my garden at the house. They were when the open garden happened last weekend. The little raspberry was probably showing the most color, and they were all budded up, showing a little color, but a week or 2 away from them getting into full bloom, and then they'll bloom the rest of the summer. But down here in South Alabama, they're probably on their 2nd round of flowering at this point. This little raspberry is such a unique color. Got asked about a lot at the house. These are, this butterfly candy series are dwarf butterfly bushes, and although dwarf, little raspberry is a little bit more vigorous in the ground than the other 4. So it's up about 3 feet in height as it's coming into full bloom at the house. Like other butterfly bushes, you cut these down in the late winter, and they just come back to that height. You don't necessarily have to cut them back, but it's kind of best to. Best practice is to kind of cut them back to about 18 inches or a little less than that on these dwarfs. And then, because all the flowers are on new growth, so last year's growth is not going to produce the flowers. It's going to have to get bigger to flower, if that makes any sense. So best to cut them back, and then they come back out, and then for me in my area, sometime around the 1st of July, all the way through frost. Down here in the south, a little bit longer than that. Pretty much everybody watching can grow these. And I just am super drawn to this little raspberry variety because it's just a color I've never seen before in butterfly bushes, and I've grown tons of butterfly bushes. One of the first videos I ever did was on my website before I had this YouTube channel, and it was all about butterfly bushes. So, I've grown just tons and tons of them, but to have a compact variety with this really, really bright coloration, something you don't, once a year, you'll go out and cut it down to about 18 inches. If you want to deadhead them, you can, meaning the spent flowers can be cut off, and then it'll branch, and basically 2 flowers will come back in its place. So you can choose to deadhead them, or for me, I typically am not quite that, I don't want to go out and spend all that time deadheading. So I'll let them come into full flower, kind of pass by, and when that flowering starts to slow down just a bit, I'll just give them a full haircut. And so they won't be blooming for a week or 2, and then they'll come back into full absolute bloom again. So either technique is fine, deadheading or shearing, your choice. But if you get your hands on one of these little raspberries, I highly recommend this one. It's just such a great plant. It's such a unique color that I just don't see on many other plants. Now I'm standing in what could only be described as an ocean of encore azaleas. They're behind the camera to the left and the right of the camera, and they go 4 rows back this direction, and there's several blocks like this in the nursery here in South Alabama. These are in 3-gallon containers here, but there's big blocks of 1 gallon and 2-gallon containers as well. It's unbelievable. These things just like midsummer, 93 degrees out here every afternoon. They go, oh, it's time to flower. And that's what a lot of them are doing here as I'm driving around the nursery this morning. They'll do that kind of full spring flower, and then they'll hit this spot during the middle of summer where they'll throw out just some sporadic flowers, which is kind of what the summer flowering is like. And then fall, they'll come back in the as the days shorten and the nights cool, they'll come back into full flower again. But it's interesting, anytime I'm down here during the summertime, there's always encore azaleas with some flowers on them. I'm standing in a few autumn rouge. I really like autumn rouge quite a bit. There's other redder ones. So autumn fire is definitely a redder flower. Autumn bonfire is a little redder of a flower. This one is more of a pinkish red, but I'm really drawn to it. It's just a great looking color. I don't tend to put as many dark reds in the garden. A lot of people do. A lot of people love dark reds, but I like more of the kind of muted reds and pinks in the garden is what I'm more drawn to. And autumn rouge is just got great foliage. Anytime I see this plant, with or without flowers, I just think the overall plant, this one's got a ton of flower buds on it, but as you can see, just how nice and compact this plant actually is. The new growth looks great on it. But here it is midsummer, and the encore azaleas, on a 93, 94 degree day are going, yeah, let's do some flowering. That would be a good idea. I don't spend a whole lot of time on the channel talking about crepe myrtles, but there are some of the dark foliage ones I do like, and we have one in a container at the house. I have a Delta Fusion in the container at the house. This is Delta Eclipse. Delta Eclipse is a slightly kind of lighter pink than Fusion is. Fusion has a little darker pink than this. There's a white variety and a much darker pink as well. But I really like how these the pink flowering ones really stand out against this much darker foliage on them. It's just like it's like cotton candy almost sitting on top of the black foliage, and it really stands out. Sometimes we can use these foliage colors to accentuate something. In this case, the flowers are being accentuated and almost held up by this dark foliage that you don't see as much. So it's like again like cotton candy floating out here in the field. It's quite striking. But again, if you can find any of these Delta series crepe myrtles are good. I had a couple of them at the old house, and I currently have a Delta Fusion in a container. And I like that contrast between that bright pink flower and that dark foliage. One other plant that got asked about several times during the open garden was the Roman candle podocarpus. It's just such a vivid plant. This one grows a little slower than green podocarpus, which is kind of normal for plants with a lot of white color in them, and variegations and that kind of thing tend to grow a little slower. It's not always true. There are some very fast growing plants like that as well, but definitely in this podocarpus, you'll see the green podocarpus. If you're trying to use one as a screening plant, will probably grow much quicker and create a screen. These will eventually do the same thing. It's just going to be a little bit slower to get there, but you could take one of these and use it in a container for a couple of years as an accent plant in a container, and then plug it in someplace once it's got some height on it, and it's kind of grown out of that container. You can put it into the garden, but it's just such a great plant. Every time I see it, especially if it's in a block, we have a couple of them at the house. You know how our garden is like one of everything. But when I have seen them in a block, like this, man, is it showy. It's just incredibly showy. And it's a super easy plant. This is definitely a southern conifer. So a lot of the conifers we think of as more northern plants, but podocarpus are definitely heat loving. Don't like a lot of winter cold on them. Down in a lot of southern areas, you'll see these used as screening plants on narrow lots, if you have a narrow lot, because you can see how upright and narrow these podocarpus want to grow. But this one's called Roman Candle. If you haven't seen it, either at the open garden or on the channel before, it's definitely worth finding if you can find one. Again, you can use it as a container plant for a couple of seasons while you wait to get a little bit of growth on it if you're going to use it as a screening plant, or like me, I just use it as an accent plant, and I'm just going to keep it around 3 or 4 feet tall permanently. Here's a few of these red sky hollies that have been allowed to grow out into a 7-gallon container. So, I'm 6 feet tall, so they're just short of 5 feet maybe in the container here. And again, I can see that they pruned them recently, and then that new growth starts on them and all that burgundy color. But this is ultimately what they're going to do in your garden, is get about as tall as you want them to get, and upright and narrow. And I think, I don't see any splaying on these, so I think that there is a little more rigidity in these as well, that sky pencils maybe don't have. Because when I grew sky pencils, the taller they get, the more likely they are to kind of splay open. But these seem pretty daggone rigid. One thing you can do to prevent that from happening so much in the future is occasionally just kind of top prune it a little bit, just kind of slow this growth down and let the stems on it thicken up a little bit, so that they're not supporting, it's not skinny little stems supporting a 10-foot tall plant in the future. But this one overall just seems a little more rigid in general. I had a couple people asking me on the Dragon Prince cryptomeria at the house how low they could keep it. Mine is about the size of these, I think, 3-gallon containers. These have been in these containers for a long time. Big, beautiful showpiece ones that they take to various shows and that kind of thing. But this one is, they're about 2 feet above the pot and maybe slightly wider than that. And that's about what mine is in 4 years. So this is similar to Globosinana cryptomeria, but Globosinana will get to growing a little bit faster. This one just has the leaf internodes, or the branching on the stems, is slightly closer together, which makes it a little more compact and also slightly slower growing, which I think is good for a dwarf conifer, because dwarf and conifer just means slow growing. Most dwarf conifers will get whatever size they want to get over time. I've seen Globosinana cryptomeria 7 and 8 feet tall before, but more typically kept around 3 to 4 feet tall on foundations. Because Globosinana is a slower growing, or because Dragon Prince is a slower growing, more compact variety, it would take a long, long time for it to reach any height like that. So in 4 years, mine's about the size of what you're seeing in these 3-gallon containers. And mine was a 3-gallon container when it started, just a slightly smaller version of this. It would take a long, long time for it to outgrow any space. And you can do a little bit of shearing on them during the late winter. Would probably be about the best time to do that. And you could keep this thing 3 or 4 feet for the next 20 years without any real issues with it. So it's not something I would fret over. But again, any dwarf conifer just means it's slow growing. It's ultimately would try to get bigger in time, but it's so far out in the distance of a problem that I just wouldn't be concerned about it. Popped over to Louisiana and getting to hang out with Buddy Lee, the inventor of Encore Azaleas, this morning. It's always a fun time to come over to Buddy's place over here and look at what he's working on. You're always working on something, on something fun.
Either ornamental plants or native plants, native meadows plants. I really enjoy just looking at them. They've been profuse blooming this year, ever since early spring.
This is a spot you burn.
This has been burned 2 years ago. I like to burn every other year, but it's getting, for me, it's more and more difficult to burn, with all the subdivisions around me now.
Right,
but,
gotcha.
But it needs burning this year.
I got you. So you don't have to seed, you're not seeding anything out here.
No.
You're burning it, and then the native plants.
They just automatically seed. And matter of fact, like Baptisia, I didn't seed Baptisia, but there was just native Baptisia in here. They've started coming up and they've started multiplying.
But all of our natives can survive that burn.
Yes.
Yes.
Right.
And it gets rid of it. This is a property that's got a lot of invasives on it because it was an old nursery.
Yes, there's, tallow trees, and Well, mimosa,
Clara,
if you break the
that has
ground,
become-
plow the ground,
Yeah.
you will just get a mass of invasive seed germinating.
Okay.
So Bradford
yeah,
pear
right.
is just everywhere.
But none of those things can survive
the fire.
the natural fires that
Right.
all of these things evolved in.
That's true.
So
and even if you don't disturb the ground,
Yes.
and you just burn,
Yeah.
you very seldom see any of the invasives germinating.
Right, gotcha. Well, so you have all the butterflies. Everybody's been asking me if I had butterflies this year. You have them all down here in Louisiana.
There's been a lot of butterflies.
Yeah.
There was a lot when we walked up here. They seemed to shuffled away.
Yeah.
But like that Monardia, that's been blooming, and there's bees on it right now.
Yeah, I see
but
native bees.
That has been blooming. That has been blooming for a long time.
So when we're looking for things for pollinators, and I said this recently, well, a lot of times we're looking for things that are most floriferous for us. Like,
Yes,
what are we drawn to?
Right.
But when you look at something like this rattlesnake master,
Yeah.
which I just got one for my garden, they're not particularly attractive flowers. They're not unattractive either. They have this blue hue
Right.
to them.
But they don't look like a flower. They look like some kind of cone there. But if you look
Yeah.
from the distance, look at all the different insects and butterflies.
Yeah.
On the rattlesnake master. I heard recently, I don't know if this is true or not, that the oldest pair of shoes made by Native American Indians that they found was made from a rattlesnake master.
Really?
Now, can't believe everything you see on the
Yeah,
internet.
right, yeah, right.
I just thought that was an interesting little bit.
Okay, well that's wild. It's a Eurygium yuccifolium, and it gets a little thorny,
Yes, it does.
a little spiny down at the bottom as it matures.
That's right. And
matures.
the flowers, the seed capsules are can be kind of, thorny also.
Right? Yeah.
But
And-
what I like about it is it germinates. I mean, it starts growing in winter.
Yeah.
And so when you don't have a lot of things around, you'll start seeing these lilies like yucca plants coming up.
Yeah, right.
And it adds a lot of color and interest, and they're fairly frost resistant.
There's another thing out here that would never have to bloom that's pretty is that Liatris baccata.
yes.
Before it blooms, it's actually as pretty as when it blooms.
That's true, and it draws the pollinators. We saw one just a few minutes ago, and it just everything's on it.
Yeah.
And my Liatris tends to not bloom at the same time. They just kind of have a bloom time of their own. This Liatris, and this is native.
Right.
This is a native. I did sow some, but they tend to reseed fairly.
Yeah, and I find them in the home garden, they can be showy, but then my rabbits will eat them for a couple years, but then they almost make them fuller. They almost like giving me free pruning for a while, because in about the third year, they're able to race out ahead of the rabbits so fast.
Yes, and they like the first couple years, they real skimpy.
Yeah.
But they said, and as they get older, they get that whole, that more bulky look, more stems coming up, just beautiful.
I like how they flower along the stems, so they flower for months. Once they start, they just flower for months. You got some fleabane.
Yes, and
it's a big collection of, and it's just in Rudbeckia back there.
Right.
But it's amazing how many things
and there's a lot
come up from a controlled burn.
There's a lot of asters also in here, little lavender ones and white ones.
Yeah.
This from spring all the way to frost, I usually have something blooming in this native meadow. We'll follow up. The big bloom, I guess, would be the Helianthus augustifolia.
Right. Yeah.
The swamp sunflower.
Yes.
And a lot of people think, it's a weed. Well, all of them are weeds, but right.
They're weeds to somebody. Yeah,
but I really love the Helianthus or the swamp sunflower.
So, buddy, when I was here last year, I came last summer, and you had an ocean of little 4-inch potted seedling azaleas that you had crossed for looking for various attributes in these encore azaleas.
That's right.
Right, and now they've been potted in over the last year. And how big are they now?
Yeah, well, they, even though I don't really force them with a lot of fertilizer, this seedling from germination is less than 2 years old. That's pretty impressive.
Yeah.
And this was in a 4-inch last year. It was only about this about that small when we potted in a 4-inch, but this is one of them.
How many are in these 3 rows or so?
Well, there's about 6 rows. There's about 25,000.
25,000.
25,000 in
Right.
6-inch containers.
And they're all genetically somewhat different, potentially, because they're crosses, and they're.
That's true.
You're not going to introduce 25,000 new encore azaleas, are you? Okay, right. So how are you going to whittle them down?
Well, we whittle them down just by physically looking at leaves. We were at one, and even though there's a lot of seedlings here, there's a lot of different groups that we know what the breeding program or the breeding target was, what traits we were looking for.
Right.
And we were looking for a certain leaf color.
Yes.
Well, actually, this isn't all the 25,000. There's more over there.
So you've been pulling out the ones that are showing the traits that
we start pulling out plants that show the trait in the leaf, and
Right.
I've been breeding for leaf color and different things with the leaf.
Right.
That's easy to
Right.
find.
Gotcha.
But now we're also doing some work with fragrance. Now that's a tough one.
Right.
And that project stems from a couple 10 years ago. Then I'm doing back crosses.
Right.
But we have to literally let them grow and see. Really, I guess if I'm doing fragrance, I have to smell every flower. But I probably won't do that.
Yeah. So in the fall they'll obviously bloom in the fall. Do you do something to trigger that bloom a little bit?
No. And these. No, I don't do anything. There's no chemical.
Yeah. I mean, I know the encores are going to bloom in the fall.
Right.
I'm just wondering if you're fertilizing them too much or anything like that.
Well, I fertilized them one time.
Right.
And then I'm not going to fertilize them again.
Yeah, because that can help. Being a little lean can sometimes make them bloom a little more.
If they'll tend to set. I've noticed they tend to set bloom buds if they start stressing out, and they're really not stressed out. It's just that I don't want them too juicy. I don't want them all juiced up from fertilizer.
Gotcha.
And we want them to set bloom buds. And another thing, as you can tell, there's a lot of plants in here, and they're pot to pot.
Yeah.
So they, the ideal thing would be to space all these.
Yeah.
But just space wise. But so that's why I don't want to put any more fertilizer on them. But honestly, they look good. They're growing great. They don't need fertilizer.
Right. Yeah.
So that's the thing. And so we just start eliminating when they start blooming, and we see one that we don't like or a color. We slowly start, eliminating them. And and this group here, it may take me 3 years or 3 cycles to eliminate a lot of them.
Right. So you're looking, it's plant form and vigor,
Yes.
it's flower color, it's stem color, it's foliage color.
Right.
Maybe fragrance. Hopefully,
Maybe
fragrance is the bucket list item.
Right.
Fragrant encores
with just some good luck, maybe a yellow blooming would show up.
Yeah, right. Right. I got
But
you.
if you're shooting for the sky, you just will go for it.
Yeah.
But these here. And you never know what's going to show up.
Yeah.
So when you got this many plants and they're all genetically different, there could be anything showed up, and that's what I'm looking for.
And for those folks watching, the craziest part of that is you may whittle these down to 10, 15, 20 plants. And then it's got to go through a test of can the nursery grow it,
right?
And will it hold up in the ground, over some period of time. So there's
so much going on.
It might just be a great container plant, and you may find that out after all this.
That's true, and I've seen plants that actually failed in production.
Yeah,
where you start mass producing it.
Yeah.
And so and usually we'll start the production asexual. Not mass production, but on a small scale.
Right, trials, 500 trial 1,000.
And we leave them in, I believe today it's supposed to be 100 degrees, so they get subjected. Winters come, I don't really cover them up. They're just here.
Right.
They're here.
Yeah, they got a survival of the fittest.
They got to survive.
Yeah, and with 25,000, you're going to find.
That's true, and the weather sometimes helps eliminate. But honestly, a lot of these that are here are second and third generation. And a lot of them's got cold hardiness in them. So, you never can tell about cold weather. They might get down to 0 here. You never know.
So these were crosses from 2 years ago, but last year
when you went to do all your crossing, what happened with the heat?
Well, last year was kind of a tough year because that Christmas we had a lot of cold weather.
Right.
And it kind of damaged the plants. Well, the plants survived that. And then in April, we had a severe freeze that basically burnt and fried the bloom buds and all like that.
Yeah.
And so our actual crossing, unless we had them protected in the greenhouse, we lost them.
Yeah.
However, following that up, we had 108 degrees. So that was like 3 events in the same time frame.
Right.
That was horrible on plants. So every year is different. You just gotta just go for it and just keep going for it. But so far this spring has been nice, and this summer is going to be hot, but I hope not as hot as last year.
Yeah.
But it's a test too.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because I'm down here. Last year when I was down here, it was a little bit later than this, but it was not that far after the 4th of July. It was 100 and some degrees down here.
Yeah.
This week I'm down here, it's 89, 90, and it's 100 at the house in Raleigh.
Right.
So I escaped. I think maybe I've escaped the 100 degree to weather for this year. So thank you so much, buddy.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.